At 3:33 in the morning on October 25, 1944, the USS West Virginia opened fire at a target 15 miles away in complete darkness. Nobody on either side could see the other fleet. No searchlights, no silhouettes, no horizon. Yet somewhere ahead in the Surigao Strait, American radar already knew exactly where the Japanese battleship Yamashiro would be before her crew even realized they had entered a trap. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura knew American forces were waiting at the northern end of the strait. He knew his fleet was outnumbered. He knew there was a strong chance he would never return. He sailed in anyway. Before dawn, more than 4,000 Japanese sailors would be dead. Battleships would burn in the darkness. Entire warships would vanish beneath the water, and one of the most powerful naval forces Japan still possessed would effectively cease to exist. But the Battle of Surigao Strait did not begin that night. It began almost 3 years earlier, at Pearl Harbor. Because the ships Japan had once sent to the bottom of the harbor had come back, and they had come back with something Japan never expected. If you enjoy forgotten World War II stories told with original research and detailed documentaries, take 1 second and subscribe. I spent hours researching every number, every ship movement, and every timeline in this story, because Surigao Strait was not just another battle. It was the night an entire era of naval warfare came to an end. Now let's go back to where this really began. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura already knew something was wrong. By October of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer fighting the same war it had started 3 years earlier. Earlier victories had created an image of unstoppable expansion across the Pacific. But now the direction had reversed. Japan was losing ground, and more importantly, Japan was losing resources it could not easily replace. Ships could sometimes be repaired. Aircraft could sometimes be rebuilt. Pilots could sometimes be retrained. But fuel was becoming a different problem entirely. As American forces pushed through the Pacific and General MacArthur returned to the Philippines, Japanese planners understood the danger immediately. The sea routes connecting Japan to oil fields in the Dutch East Indies were becoming increasingly threatened. And without oil, the entire war machine slowed down. Battleships required fuel, destroyers required fuel, aircraft required fuel, factories required fuel. Without it, even surviving ships gradually became useless. Japan could survive military defeats. Japan could not survive running out of oil. The problem for Japan was that wars on the scale of the Pacific conflict consumed resources at a rate almost impossible to sustain indefinitely. Battleships alone burned enormous amounts of fuel simply moving across the ocean. Destroyers escorting fleets consumed more. Aircraft carriers consumed more. Aircraft themselves consumed fuel during training, patrols, transport missions, and combat operations. Even maintaining a fleet without fighting could gradually drain reserves. And by late 1944, Japan was no longer operating under the conditions that had existed earlier in the war. In 1942, expansion had brought advantages. Captured territories provided resources. Captured ports extended reach. Captured airfields expanded defensive positions. But expansion created another problem: distance. As the war continued, Japan had to defend larger areas while simultaneously replacing losses it could increasingly struggle to replace. The Pacific Ocean itself became an enemy. Every island required supplies, every fleet movement required fuel, every convoy required protection. American submarines had also begun creating pressure throughout Japanese supply routes. Ships carrying critical resources increasingly faced attacks before reaching their destinations. The effect was gradual rather than immediate. No single event suddenly collapsed the system. Instead, pressure continued building month after month. Smaller shortages became larger shortages. Larger shortages became strategic problems, and strategic problems eventually became military problems. Because a navy without enough fuel eventually stops becoming a navy, it becomes a collection of ships sitting in harbors. Japanese commanders understood this. They understood that if the Philippines were lost, the situation would become significantly worse, which meant Operation Shō-Gō was not simply another offensive operation. It was becoming something else, a gamble. Possibly the largest gamble Japan had attempted during the later stages of the war. And like most gambles, success depended on many things happening correctly at the same time. The problem was that war rarely cooperates with perfect plans. Inside Tokyo, naval planners could already see where the mathematics of war was leading. Fewer experienced pilots, fewer ships, less fuel, less time. Something had to happen. And so Admiral Somu Toyota approved what became known as Operation Shō-Gō, or Victory Operation. On paper, it looked brilliant. Multiple Japanese forces would attack from different directions at almost the same time. A northern carrier force would act as bait, drawing American carrier groups away from the Philippines while larger surface fleets moved toward the landing forces. If everything worked, American operations around Leyte could suffer catastrophic damage. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. The entire operation depended on timing, perfect timing. Multiple fleets separated by enormous distances needed to arrive almost simultaneously despite unreliable communications, damaged ships, and constant American attacks. One delay could affect another fleet. One damaged ship could disrupt an entire formation. One mistake could begin collapsing everything. And among all the commanders involved, one man had perhaps the most dangerous route of all. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. He had his orders: sail north, enter Leyte Gulf, attack. What Nishimura did not yet know was that somewhere ahead, American commanders had already started preparing for his arrival, waiting. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura had spent more than 30 years inside the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was not known for dramatic speeches. He was not known for political influence. He was known for something simpler. He followed orders. And by October of 1944, those orders had placed him at the center of one of the most dangerous missions of the Pacific War. His force still looked powerful. 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, 1 heavy cruiser, Mogami, 4 destroyers, 7 warships moving north toward Leyte Gulf. On paper, that sounded dangerous. Against isolated targets, against transport ships, against weaker formations, it absolutely was. But paper had started lying by late 1944, because strength on paper and strength at sea were no longer always the same thing. Many Japanese ships had already survived earlier campaigns and returned damaged before being repaired and sent back into combat again. Fuel shortages had reduced training opportunities. Experienced crews had gradually been replaced by men with far less combat experience than those who had fought earlier in the war. The fleet still looked powerful, but the reality beneath those numbers had changed, and then there was the route itself. Surigao Strait was not open ocean. That mattered. Battleships became dangerous when they had room to maneuver, room to turn, room to reposition, room to change formation. Inside a narrow stretch of water, many of those advantages disappeared. Nishimura's force would be moving through darkness inside a confined corridor with coastlines on both sides. And because of that geography, his ships had only one practical formation available: column formation, one ship behind another, like headlights moving through a tunnel at night. At first glance, that might not sound important, but it would become one of the most important details of the entire battle. Because ships arranged in a narrow line could only bring limited firepower directly forward, and somewhere ahead, an American commander was preparing to use that fact against him. Nishimura likely understood parts of the risk. Experienced officers usually did. They could often feel when operations no longer moved according to plan, but turning around did not guarantee survival. Continuing forward did not guarantee victory. By then, the mission had developed its own momentum. The engines continued turning. The ships continued north. Orders remained unchanged. And as darkness settled across the water, crews moved through passageways under combat lighting while officers studied charts and ammunition crews prepared shells. Ahead of them, there was only darkness. No visible enemy ships, no gunfire. No indication that an entire American force had already begun moving into position. But there was another problem Nishimura faced. He was not supposed to be alone. Operation Shō-Gō had been designed around multiple forces arriving at nearly the same time from different directions. Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima was expected to follow behind with additional ships, while farther north Admiral Kurita's center force moved toward its own objectives. The operation depended on coordination, the operation depended on timing, and timing in war has a habit of falling apart. Ships suffered damage, communications became unreliable. Distances across the Pacific created delays that commanders could not completely control. Small problems began becoming larger ones. A ship arriving late could force an entire fleet to adjust. A damaged vessel could slow movement. Hours could separate forces expected to arrive together. Nishimura probably did not know exactly how serious these disruptions had become. But experienced officers often sensed when something felt wrong. The silence itself could become suspicious. Because warships rarely moved through hostile waters without information flowing constantly around them. Reports, updates, orders, corrections. Instead, the darkness around Nishimura remained almost unchanged. Only engines, only waves against steel, only the sound of 7 ships continuing north. And sometimes that kind of silence creates false confidence, because the absence of gunfire does not necessarily mean safety. Sometimes it simply means the enemy is waiting. And somewhere farther north, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had already begun placing every piece exactly where he wanted it. While Nishimura's ships continued north through the darkness, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was doing something far more dangerous than simply preparing for battle. He was building a trap. Unlike the Japanese commanders moving through uncertain conditions with incomplete information, Oldendorf possessed something almost every commander wants and very few ever receive in war: time. American intelligence had already been tracking Japanese fleet movements. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft, intercepted communications, and fleet observations had gradually created a picture of what was happening across the Philippine waters. The exact details were not always clear, but the direction was. Japanese naval forces were approaching, and one of them would likely attempt to move through Surigao Strait. Oldendorf received his orders during the afternoon of October 24th and immediately began positioning his ships. He commanded a force that looked overwhelming compared to what Nishimura was bringing north. 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, 39 PT boats. But the numbers alone were not the most important advantage. The positioning was. The geography of Surigao Strait created a problem for anyone attempting to move north through it. The waters stretched roughly from south to north before opening into Leyte Gulf. Ships entering from the southern entrance eventually had only one destination available to them: the northern exit. Oldendorf understood that if he positioned his ships correctly, the Japanese would effectively sail toward him in a predictable line. And predictable movement in naval warfare could be deadly. He divided his forces into layers. The first layer would consist of PT boats sent farther south into the strait itself. Their mission was not necessarily to sink battleships. Their mission was information: find the enemy, track the enemy, report everything: position, direction, speed. Every minute Nishimura remained inside the strait, American commanders would know more about where he was. Behind the PT boats came destroyers. Their role would be far more violent. They would attack from both sides of the strait using torpedoes before withdrawing under cover of smoke and darkness. The destroyers did not need to destroy the entire Japanese fleet. They only needed to create damage and confusion. A battleship slowed by torpedo damage, a destroyer forced out of formation, a cruiser unable to maintain speed. Any disruption inside the narrow waters could create larger problems farther north. And farther north waited the final layer: the battleships. Oldendorf arranged them across the northern exit of Surigao Strait from east to west, waiting, silent. Every ship positioned so its full broadside could fire south toward anything emerging from the darkness. Naval officers had studied this maneuver for decades. Entire careers had been spent discussing it in classrooms and war colleges. Crossing the T. One fleet moving forward in a narrow line, another waiting perpendicular across its path. The fleet crossing the top of the T could bring nearly every gun into action at once. The approaching fleet could use only its forward guns. The difference in firepower could become overwhelming. And on that night, Oldendorf was not simply planning to execute it. He was preparing to execute it using ships Japan believed it had already destroyed. Because among the American battleships waiting in the darkness at the West Virginia, California, and Tennessee, Pearl Harbor survivors, raised from the bottom, rebuilt, and carrying something the Japanese had never expected to face: radar. But this was not the radar Japan had encountered earlier in the war. This was no longer experimental equipment struggling to identify vague contacts somewhere beyond the horizon. The ships waiting at the northern end of the strait had returned from reconstruction carrying systems that fundamentally changed naval combat itself. For decades, battleship warfare had depended on visibility: find the enemy, estimate distance, adjust fire, correct mistakes, repeat. But now darkness itself was becoming less important. An enemy fleet no longer needed to be seen, it only needed to be detected. Somewhere in the darkness to the south, Nishimura continued moving toward the strait. And somewhere farther north, American radar operators were waiting for the first signals to appear on their screens. The trap was ready. Now all it needed was someone to sail into it. At 10:36 on the evening of October 24th, the first American PT boats made contact with Nishimura's force. The battle had begun, not with battleships, not with massive guns, and not with explosions powerful enough to shake steel hulls. It began with small wooden boats moving through darkness. PT boats had never been designed to fight battleships directly. They were fast, lightly armed craft intended to attack larger ships and disappear before return fire could destroy them. Against destroyers or transport ships, they could be dangerous. Against battleships, they were something else: eyes. Oldendorf had sent 39 of them into the strait for a reason. Their mission was not necessarily to sink Japanese warships. Their mission was to see, and more importantly, to report. As Nishimura advanced northward, PT boat crews began transmitting updates back to American command. Position, heading, speed. Every message removed uncertainty. Every report made the trap tighter. For the crews aboard the PT boats, the experience was far from calm. The darkness around them was almost complete. Ship silhouettes appeared only briefly against the horizon. Large shadows moved silently across black water before disappearing again. Then came flashes. Japanese guns began firing. Columns of water erupted around the small American craft as shells landed nearby. Searchlights occasionally cut through darkness before disappearing again. Some PT boats launched torpedoes. None produced decisive results. But damage had never been the real objective. Time was, information was, and they succeeded. As reports continued reaching Oldendorf, the American commander could now follow Nishimura's movement almost like a moving marker across a map. He knew where the Japanese were. He knew how fast they were moving. He knew where they would likely be next. Meanwhile, farther north, destroyer squadrons were beginning to move into attack positions. Unlike the PT boats, their purpose was not observation. Their purpose was destruction. The destroyers waited on both sides of the strait, hidden in darkness. Crews prepared torpedoes. Officers studied distances and timing. Because soon Nishimura would enter the narrowest and most dangerous section of the route. And when he did, the first real strike of the night would begin. Within a few hours, entire ships would already be burning, and one Japanese battleship would begin disappearing beneath the water before ever reaching the American battle line. Shortly after midnight, the destroyers began moving. Unlike battleships, destroyers operated differently. Speed was their protection. Surprise was their advantage. They would move into attack range, launch torpedoes, and disappear before enemy guns could lock onto them. The crews had rehearsed this. Distances had been calculated. Approach angles had been chosen. Everything depended on timing. As Japanese ships continued north, American destroyers approached from both sides of the strait. Then torpedoes entered the water, invisible in darkness. moving silently toward targets that had no reliable way of knowing exactly where they had come from. Minutes later, the first impacts arrived. The Japanese battleship Fuso took torpedo hits and began slowing. Formation immediately started becoming unstable. Ships moving behind her were suddenly forced to adjust course. Destroyers attempted to maintain spacing while avoiding confusion in the darkness. Then more torpedoes arrived, more explosions, more fires. For crews aboard Japanese vessels, understanding exactly what was happening became increasingly difficult. Visibility remained poor. Smoke drifted across sections of the strait. Reports coming from different ships often conflicted with one another. Some commanders believed additional enemy forces were nearby. Others believed attacks were coming from different directions. The battle was becoming disorganized, and confusion inside a narrow channel could spread quickly. Fuso continued burning. At some point during the night, the exact sequence remains debated. The battleship suffered catastrophic damage and eventually broke apart. Two burning sections of the ship drifted separately through the darkness. To anyone arriving later, they no longer looked like pieces of one vessel. They looked like two separate ships on fire. Behind the destruction, Yamashiro continued north. Nishimura had already lost ships. He had already entered a trap. He already knew American forces were somewhere ahead, and still, he kept sailing forward. Before we continue, if you're still watching, you're already part of a very small percentage of people who stay this far into the video, so subscribe if you haven't already, because what happens next is where everything changes. The Japanese still had ships moving north. They still had guns. They still had armor. What they did not realize was that the battle had already started being decided long before anyone could see the enemy. By the early hours of October 25th, Nishimura's force had already been damaged before reaching its true objective. Destroyer attacks had broken formations. Ships were burning behind him. The Fuso was gone. Multiple destroyers had been sunk or crippled. Yet the Japanese column continued north. Now only a smaller force remained: the battleship Yamashiro, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and a handful of surviving destroyers. Ahead of them, darkness still covered the northern end of Surigao Strait. No battle line was visible. No massive fleet could be seen waiting. No searchlights cut through the horizon. From Nishimura's position, the sea ahead looked almost empty, but the Americans no longer needed visibility. Because somewhere aboard the USS West Virginia, operators were staring at glowing returns on the Mark 8 fire control radar. The system had already detected the approaching Japanese force long before anyone could physically see ships in the darkness. This was one of the most important technological differences of the entire battle. For decades, naval combat had depended on visibility and estimation. Commanders searched for enemy ships. Rangefinders calculated distances. Gunners corrected shots after observing impacts. The process took time. Mistakes happened constantly. Darkness complicated everything. The Mark 8 changed that. The radar could determine range, bearing, and movement with extraordinary precision for its time. In practical terms, American ships no longer needed visual contact to begin calculating firing solutions. They already knew where the enemy was, and more importantly, they knew where the enemy would be. As Yamashiro continued moving north, American radar tracked every mile, every course adjustment, every movement. For nearly half an hour, the target continued approaching. The crews aboard the American battleships remained at their stations, waiting. No one fired, not yet. Oldendorf wanted every element of the trap complete. Destroyers had attacked. PT boats had reported positions. Cruisers stood ready on the flanks. And across the northern exit of the strait waited 6 American battleships positioned east to west: West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Mississippi. Some of them had once rested at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Now they sat waiting in darkness for the fleet that had unknowingly helped create them. Naval officers had discussed this tactical maneuver for generations, crossing the T. For most, it had existed more in classrooms than in combat, but now it was real. Nishimura's ships moved north in a narrow column. Oldendorf's battle line stretched horizontally across their path. Every American battleship could fire nearly its entire broadside. The Japanese could use only their forward guns. The geometry itself had become a weapon. For the men aboard the Yamashiro, nothing ahead looked unusual. No horizon filled with enemy silhouettes. No line of battleships visible in the darkness. No indication that 6 American battleships were already positioned directly across their route. The Japanese crews could hear engines. They could feel the movement of the ship beneath their feet. They knew they were approaching combat, but they could not yet see it. Meanwhile, aboard the West Virginia, the situation looked completely different. Radar operators watched bright returns appear and move across their displays. Distances continued shrinking. 40,000 yards, 35,000, 30,000. Closer, closer. Every few moments, new calculations reached the fire control systems: speed, direction, predicted position. The process seemed almost unreal compared to traditional naval combat. For centuries, warships had fought using visibility and direct observation. Now mathematics and electronics were beginning to replace eyesight. The Japanese crews were sailing toward an enemy they could not see. The Americans were preparing to fire at targets they could not see. And for the first time in naval history, one side effectively understood the battlefield while the other remained almost blind. The men loading ammunition inside the American battleships had no way of knowing they were preparing for the last great battleship engagement in history. Some had survived Pearl Harbor, some had watched ships burn in the harbor years earlier, some had spent months aboard vessels that many believed would never return to combat. Now those same ships sat in darkness waiting for a fleet approaching directly toward them. Everything Oldendorf had prepared throughout the evening had led to this exact moment. The PT boats, the destroyer attacks, the positioning, the timing, everything. At approximately 3:33 in the morning, the waiting ended. The USS West Virginia opened fire, and in an instant darkness became light. At 3:33 in the morning, the USS West Virginia opened fire. Seconds later, other American battleships joined in, the California, the Tennessee. Then cruisers on the flanks began adding their guns to the bombardment. Suddenly, the darkness over Surigao Strait disappeared beneath repeated flashes of gunfire. For the Japanese crews aboard Yamashiro, the experience must have felt almost unreal, because they still could not clearly see the ships firing at them, and that was the real problem. For centuries, naval combat had followed a familiar process. You saw the enemy, you estimated range, you adjusted fire, you corrected mistakes, then repeated the process again. But Yamashiro was now fighting a battle that had changed its rules. The Americans were firing using radar-guided solutions that had already calculated where Japanese ships would be by the time shells arrived. The Japanese were firing largely into darkness, and that difference mattered more than armor thickness. It mattered more than courage, because even the strongest battleship in the world becomes vulnerable if it cannot accurately return fire. Imagine trying to fight someone standing across a room with the lights turned off. Now imagine that person can see you perfectly. That was the situation inside Surigao Strait, and it meant the outcome had already started becoming unavoidable. The battle had not truly been decided when West Virginia opened fire. The battle had been decided earlier. It had been decided when Oldendorf arranged his fleet. It had been decided when destroyers disrupted Nishimura's formation. It had been decided when Pearl Harbor survivors returned, carrying technology Japan had never expected. Now the consequences were simply arriving. Shell after shell continued crashing into Yamashiro. 16-inch armor-piercing rounds weighing thousands of pounds crossed miles of darkness before slamming into steel. Explosions tore through compartments. Fires spread. Crew members attempted damage control while the ship continued moving forward. And remarkably, Nishimura still did not turn away, because turning away created another problem. Inside the narrow waters of Surigao Strait, reversing course under concentrated fire risked creating even greater confusion among surviving ships. A damaged ship turning unexpectedly could block movement. Ships behind could collide. formation could completely collapse. Forward remained the only option, even if forward now meant sailing directly into destruction. Within minutes, Mogami was burning, destroyers were disappearing, and the Yamashiro was absorbing punishment no battleship had been designed to endure for long. But what made the situation even worse for the Japanese fleet was that every minute made the imbalance larger. American ships were not firing individually, they were firing together. That distinction mattered. A single battleship could survive extraordinary punishment. Battleships were designed around exactly that idea. Massive armor belts, reinforced compartments, and damage control procedures existed because naval engineers assumed ships would eventually take hits. But no battleship had been designed to survive concentrated fire from multiple ships simultaneously, especially not under conditions where accurate return fire was nearly impossible. Every impact created secondary problems. Communications failed. Electrical systems suffered damage. Smoke spread through sections of the ship. Officers attempting to understand the situation received incomplete reports from different compartments. One section reported flooding, another reported fires, another reported damage to weapon systems, and all of this happened while additional shells continued arriving. Inside combat information rooms and engineering compartments, men were making decisions with incomplete information and almost no time. Some crews continued trying to save the ship. Others simply tried to survive. Because eventually a moment arrives in battle where winning is no longer the question. The question becomes how long you can remain afloat. And somewhere aboard Yamashiro, Nishimura likely understood exactly what was happening. The mission was collapsing, the fleet was collapsing, but the ship continued north, because there was nowhere else left to go. 40 minutes earlier, Nishimura had entered Surigao Strait with a force. Soon, he would barely have a fleet left at all. At 4:19 in the morning, the Yamashiro finally disappeared beneath the water. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura went down with his ship. He had entered Surigao Strait knowing American forces were likely waiting ahead. He had watched parts of his force disappear around him. He had continued north after torpedo attacks. He had continued north after ships began burning. He had continued north after the American battle line opened fire, and in the end, he continued north until there was nothing left to command. But the destruction of Nishimura's force was not yet completely over. Roughly 30 minutes behind him, Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima was still moving toward the strait with the second Japanese force, and Shima had almost no understanding of what had happened ahead. Radio communication during the battle had become unreliable and fragmented. Reports had been incomplete. Darkness and confusion had separated formations from one another. So as Shima approached the area, he relied mostly on visual observations and radar contacts. What he saw looked strange. Ahead in the darkness were two large burning objects drifting across the water. From his perspective, it appeared that two large ships had been destroyed. But what Shima did not realize was that both burning contacts were actually parts of the same ship. Fuso, broken apart, still burning, still floating. For a brief moment, the battlefield itself was creating confusion, and confusion during a night engagement could be deadly. As Shima attempted to maneuver through the increasingly chaotic waters, his flagship Nachi collided with the damaged Mogami. Steel struck steel. Both ships suffered additional damage, and suddenly Shima faced a situation no commander wanted. Burning wreckage ahead, damaged ships around him, an American battle line somewhere farther north, and almost no reliable information. At that point, the decision became obvious. He turned around. The second Japanese force withdrew without entering the destruction that had consumed Nishimura, and with that decision, the Battle of Surigao Strait effectively ended. More than 4,000 Japanese sailors had been killed. Of Nishimura's original force, almost nothing remained. Only the destroyer Shigure managed to escape. But perhaps the strangest part of the story came afterward. Because Surigao Strait was not simply another naval victory, it was the end of something. For decades, military planners around the world had believed massive battleships would decide the future of naval warfare. Entire fleets had been built around that idea. Entire doctrines had been written around that idea. But by October of 1944, reality had changed. Aircraft had changed it, radar had changed it, technology had changed it. The final battleship-versus-battleship engagement in history had not ended in a dramatic duel between equal fleets. It ended with radar-guided fire in darkness. And there was one final irony. The ships that helped close the era of battleships were ships Japan itself had once sent to the bottom at Pearl Harbor. 3 years earlier, those vessels had been left burning in shallow water. 3 years later, they came back, and they ended the battleship era forever. What made Surigao Strait different from many other famous battles of the Second World War was that the outcome had not depended on a single brilliant maneuver in the middle of combat. The result had been building for years. It began at Pearl Harbor, continued through salvage operations, continued through reconstruction, continued through engineers installing systems that did not even exist when those ships first entered service. The men aboard West Virginia were not simply fighting with the same ship that had sunk in Hawaii. In many ways, they were fighting with something entirely different. Japan had expected damaged ships to return eventually. What Japan had not expected was that those ships would return transformed. And perhaps that was the final lesson of Surigao Strait. Wars do not always end because one side suddenly becomes weaker. Sometimes wars end because one side changes faster than the other. Before sunrise on October 25, 1944, the era of the battleship effectively ended, and the ships that closed that chapter of history had once rested beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Surigao Strait did not become famous because it was the largest naval battle of the Second World War. It became important because of what it ended. For decades, military planners believed fleets of massive battleships would decide the future of warfare at sea. Entire navies were built around that assumption. Entire strategies depended on it. Then technology changed faster than those assumptions did. Radar changed it. Aircraft changed it. The war itself changed it. And in the early hours of October 25, 1944, the final battleship-versus-battleship engagement in history came to an end. Not in a dramatic duel between equal fleets, not beneath clear skies, but in darkness, guided by radar, fought by ships that had once rested on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. 3 years earlier, they had been left burning in shallow water. 3 years later, they returned and closed the chapter on the battleship era forever. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more forgotten stories from World War II that history books usually reduce to a few paragraphs, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And let me know below, did Japan ever have a realistic chance at Surigao Strait? Or had the battle already been lost long before the first shot was fired? We'll see you in the next one.